So, as we all know, Geraldo is an amazing hero for expert chimps, but he can be pretty hard to use. So today I'll be going over how to use Geraldo's items the most effective way you can on expert chimps. Even though I say specifically expert chimps, these tips can be applied pretty much anywhere on any map difficulty. So, let's get started with Geraldo's first item, the shooty turret. The shooty turret is one of Geraldo's most useful early game items, as 2 to 3 of them can basically carry you until about round 30 where they start to fall off. The main perk of the shooty turrets, however, is that they have an amazing 10 pierce. 10 pierce is a lot and can carry a lot of dense rounds in the early game like 15, 21, and 27. The 10 pierce also makes it so the turrets benefit from being on a straight line a lot. Like, a lot. Because it's expert maps, there aren't too many straight lines, but do the best you can. I'm not going to show any good enough straight lines because you have eyes and you can figure that out, hopefully. Normally you only want 2 to 3 of these to help with your pre-round 30 early game, but sometimes on some situations and some maps you might want to get a few more. The turrets do get upgraded at some point at Geraldo level 13 or something, but these upgraded turrets do not scale well at all into the mid to late game, so it's not worth getting them. That wraps it up for the shooty turret. Now we can move on to the stack of old nails. I'm gonna be 100% honest, I don't really know what to say with this one. Put them at the end of the track if you need to catch leaks. That's literally it. Anyways, now let's move on to the actual next item. The creepy idol, or as most people call it, the totem. The way the creepy idol works is it blows back 25% of Bloons that enter its range, and then at level 18 it gains an effect where if it expires or you sell it mid-round, because you can do that, it'll drop a layer of unstable concoction on nearby Moabs. The creepy idol doesn't do much in the early game. At this point, glue is just better, so don't really use it in the early game. The mid game is where you start to see it used a bit more, but glue is still better at this point. But if you do use it on dense ceramic rounds where it'll blow back more Bloons, like 63, 76, and 78. But the late game is really where it starts to pick up and become a valuable addition to your defense. For the cheap price of $110, it'll blow back tons of ceramics and stun Moabs all at the same time, which is really good to have on dense Bloon rounds like 96, 94, 98, 95 even if you need it for DDTs, which sometimes you don't, sometimes you do. Really depends on the setup. And the unstable concoction effect from my testing isn't like that good. It works, it's a nice addition, but I would rather just keep the stuns and blowbacks for longer than sell it mid-round and not have it anymore. That wraps up the creepy idol. Now we'll be moving on to our next item. One of Geraldo's most famous items, the jar of pickles. Pickles will give the target monkey +1 damage at a 33% attack speed loss. And at higher levels, it also gives bonus damage to fortified Bloons, which is very useful in the late game, as we all know that fortifieds are what make 98 scary, and they're just a pain to deal with anyway. But they only last 5 rounds, so you need to know when to use them and what rounds you're gonna need to use them. Pickles tend to work best on towers that have a very high attack speed, have a lot of projectiles, or have low damage per projectile. The most important downside about pickles is that they only last 5 rounds. Pickles don't see much use in the early game, mostly because they're kind of expensive for such a temporary buff, but they do work really well with Druid of the Jungles in the mid-30s. The mid-game is where they start to pick up because there are actually sets of 5 rounds right next to each other that make sense to use a set of pickles for, like 60 through 64, or 61 to 65, 75 to 80. Those are the only rounds you're really going to be using pickles in the mid-game. But the late game is where pickles really start to pick up in usefulness. Since there are so few rounds in the late game, you can pretty much keep most things pickled at all of the important rounds. Like, if you have Geraldo restocking on round 90, which is most common for expert maps, you will be able to have pickles going from 89 all the way to 98 on 4 towers, which is usually all you need. Some common late game strategies that pickles work very well with are tack shooters, more specifically the bottom path, shrapnel snipers in general, unless it's a main Moab, Grandmaster Ninja, Sun Avatars, and Robo Monkeys. They also work well on many other towers, just don't do towers that have high damage values because they'll end up losing damage from the pickles. That's really all I have to say about pickles. Now let's move on to the next item. And the next item is the camo potion. The camo potion gives camo detection for 10 rounds, and at higher levels lasts for 15 rounds, gives extra range and +1 damage to camos. I don't really know how to explain this strategy-wise, but like, just use it. There isn't much strategy to it. If you use it, it'll benefit you. So yeah, just use it. The camo potion was pretty simple, but our next item, the glue, is a lot less simple. The glue can be placed anywhere on the track. It has 100 pierce, but only lasts for 4 rounds. Usually you'll use the pierce before it ends up going away, but I don't know, sometimes you might not. The glue is mostly used in the early and mid game because it doesn't scale too well in the late game due to a lack of pierce upgrades. But in the early game, it's usually used for rounds like 21, 22, 23, sometimes on 27 maybe, not really, 31, 35, and 36, but you can use it on more rounds if you need to. I'm not saying to use it for all of these rounds, I'm just saying that these are the rounds that you'll most commonly be using it on. But then for the mid game, it's mostly used for 43, 47, 49 sometimes, 54, 55, 63, 76, and 78. These are the rounds I see myself using the glue most often, just because it really helps with the massive ceramic rushes on these rounds. In the late game it doesn't see much use at all because it doesn't have pierce upgrades like I said before. But then it can be used in certain situations on rounds like 85, 87, 88 for the ZOMGs, 92, 94, 96 if you really need it for whatever reason. It also doesn't stack with Moab glue, so don't even bother getting glue if you have a Moab glue already. And a neat little trick with glue that I've seen people use is on the insides of the round 40 Moab, people have glued and used a maelstrom on top of each other to make sure none of the leaks can slip past if there isn't much track length left to go. But that really wraps it up for glue, and now we will move on to our next item, which is probably Geraldo's most important, the sharpening stone. The sharpening stone is so good, it's built entire strategies around it. But for what it does, it lasts 10 rounds, and it gives +1 pierce to projectiles of the sharp type. They can basically pop anything except lead and frozen Bloons. But once Geraldo reaches level 15, it gives +1 damage as well, which is how it makes strategies. The sharpening stone almost alone has built 2 of the top tier strategies right now, Geraldo snipers and Geraldo tacks. The sharpening stone has also made ISAB monkeys and dumb knights usable. But now let's get on to its early game uses, where it doesn't really have any, unless you oddly need a pierce buff on a sub for some reason. In the mid game it starts to pick up, being useful on dense ceramic rounds like 54, 55, 63, 76, and 78. It can also contribute a lot to some of the harder Moab rounds of the 70s, like 75, and more if you really wanted to. But overall, in the mid game, it is a value purchase on towers with sharp type projectiles, if those towers are contributing to your mid game at all. Like how an ISAB monkey, dumb knight, or bouncing bullet sniper might be contributing. Since this tutorial is mostly geared toward expert chimps, but the tips are mostly universal, this one is specifically for expert maps. Geraldo will generally reach his +1 damage sharpening stone level before round 75. So you might want to use a sharpening stone from 63 to 72, hope that you don't need one for 73 and 74, and then apply the +1 damage one for 75. Usually that works pretty well from my experience. But the late game is truly where the sharpening stone starts to pick up. Usually it doesn't have much use in the early to mid 80s because you should have afforded your big tier 5 tower by now, and that should just be carrying you until about round 90. And from round 90, you can keep 6 towers sharpening stoned until the end of the game, depending on when Geraldo restocks. Towers that excel with the sharpening stone in the late game are shrapnel snipers in general, bottom path tack shooters, bottom path helis, ISAB monkeys or dumb knights, and your Grandmaster Ninja in a Grandmaster strategy. But usually I like to put it on just any DPS tower that can receive the buff, as it will help out a bit. Except on a perma spike. I've tried it, it does literally nothing, but it's kind of funny. That wraps up Geraldo's most important item. Next, we'll move on to another incredibly useful item that also makes strategies, the Hero Cape. What the Hero Cape does, if you don't know, is it turns any tier 2 or lower dart monkey into a super monkey. But the main downside is that you can only upgrade these transformed super monkeys to a maximum of tier 3. Which is a lot smaller of an issue than it sounds like, because you're not usually going past tier 3s in most games, unless you're getting a Dark Champion, which is cool, fun tower, and a Tech Terror, which is even cooler, even funner tower. But anyways, let's get back on track. The main use of the Hero Cape is that you can put a bunch of dart monkeys that you're going to turn into super monkeys, combined with all of your entire defense that you'll upgrade later, all right next to each other, and then turn all of the dart monkeys into super monkeys to save a ton of space and save a lot of money, because you can fit a bunch of them in double or maybe even triple discount range. Normally you'd only be able to fit 1 to 2 super monkeys in a double discount range, but now you can fit 5 or 6, which basically created ISAB monkey spam, sun avatar spam, and dumb knight spam strategies. This can also let you fit super monkeys in places you wouldn't normally be able to fit them, like on the ledge of Dark Dungeon, and many more. But that covers most of the upsides of the Hero Cape. Now we can move on to, I think, the most interesting item, the Blade Trap. For $700, it basically just creates a maelstrom when a Bloon touches it. But it also gets upgraded to a super maelstrom at a certain Geraldo level that I'm not remembering right now. The Blade Trap has one important use in the early game, and that's for the insides of the round 40 Moab, which it just destroys for $700. But outside of that, it doesn't see much use in the early or mid game. The main reason it doesn't see any use in the mid game is because glue is just outclassing it completely. There's no reason when you would get a maelstrom instead of a glue. Usually it's not worth spending $700 for such a short use. Usually it's just better to build more permanent defenses. But then the late game is where it starts to see a few niche uses, which are pretty interesting. So the first main one is on round 80. If your defense can't handle the insides of the ZOMG, you can use one, which should be a super maelstrom by this point, to clean it up. But then after that, it has a few uses where I guess you could use it in the early 80s if you're almost done saving up for a big tier 5 tower, but even then I don't recommend it. Usually a spooky totem or an upgraded glue would just be better. You can also use the blade traps on the fortified Moab waves of round 96 if you need to, but my personal favorite use for the maelstroms is just spamming them aimlessly on round 98, because it might help, who knows. Another useful use of the blade traps is for cleaning up the round 100 insides if your defense can't really handle that. That concludes the main uses of the blade trap, but if you're doing an absolutely massive save up like I did in my Infernal Flying Fortress video, it has a few more uses which I'll show on screen right now. But that wraps up our segment on the blade trap. Now we'll move on to another really good Geraldo item, the Gerry Fire. The Gerry Fire can be applied to a tower for $540, and it lasts for 10 rounds, and it basically acts as a temporary, weaker Dragon Breath Wizard. But the things that makes it so good is that it inherits buffs that that tower receives, like a jungle drums buff. It takes that. A pop lust buff. It takes that. A shinobi buff. It takes that. It also inherits the turbocharge attack speed buff from the ability, which can let it do some crazy things, like I'll go over in the strategy section of this guide. The Gerry Fire doesn't see much use in the early game, mostly because you don't have it unlocked yet, but it starts to get used in the early 40s, early 50s, when your defense might be a little lacking and you just need an extra push to be able to beat the rounds. You can also use it in the early 60s to get through some difficult rounds like 63 and 64. It can also see some use from 70 to 80 if you just need a bit more damage to get through like round 75, 77, other difficult rounds like that. In the late game it can be very useful as it can just add a bit of extra DPS to your setup, which if you've seen my Geraldo guides, you'll know that I like spamming Gerry Fires for no reason. It helps, okay? You can also use it as some cheap round 100 damage if you really need to. But that concludes one of the more useful items in Geraldo's shop. Now we have one that, personally, I've never used. The Pet Rabbit. The Pet Rabbit costs 6k total for a thing that does a bit of damage, I guess, but is just outclassed by literally everything else. So it's not usually a good option, because on most expert maps you need to save all of the money you can and put it toward good defenses, and the rabbit just doesn't help with that. But anyways, let's move on to our next item, which is another useful one, the rejuv potion. For a neat price of 2,160 cash money, dollars, whatever you call it, it resets all ability cooldowns. That's it, and it's one of Geraldo's best items in my opinion. It has a bunch of good uses, so I'll go over them now. If your defense is really bad, like really bad against DDTs, you might need 2 sabos to stay alive. But with the rejuv potion, you don't need 2 sabos. You can just use 1 sabo, and when it runs out, use a rejuv potion and use it again. It also makes ability-based strategies like the Wizard Lord Phoenix, Plasma Monkey Fan Club, Total Transformation, and probably more that I'm not thinking of, really powerful. Because it can help with difficult round transitions where you might not be able to stall super effectively, like between 95 and 96, and 99 and 100. Also useful between 98 and 99 if you really need to. The best part about the rejuv potion in my opinion is that you can just completely cheese around 100 by using multiple spike storms or multiple first strikes without having to have multiple of those towers, which ends up saving tons of money. That just about wraps it up for the rejuv potion. Now we can move on to the final item I'll be going over today, the genie bottle. It just does a lot of damage for $2,000, but it only lasts 2 rounds, which is kind of annoying. The genies don't see any use in the early game because you don't have them unlocked yet, duh. In the mid game, they don't really have many uses unless you really need to use one from 75 to 76, then feel free to do it. It's usually not the best option. Usually there are cheaper ways, but in some very certain scenarios, it's not enough, which is understandable. But other than that, you can use them from 81 to 82 if you need to save up for a big tier 5 tower. And I still don't recommend using a genie during this time because usually there's a cheaper way. But in the mid to late 90s is when they start to get useful. There are multiple good genie setups for the late game, and I'll go over them now. The first one, which I haven't tested much but can be very good, is if you need a genie from 94 to 95, and then one for 98 to 99. This will let you restock a genie for around 100, and that's good because it does pretty good bad damage. Another good one is just double genie from 98 to 99, which I have used the most. But you can also use one from 98 to 99 and then 99 to 100. If you're in a very specific circumstance, like my Flying Fortress runs, which I'll put on screen now, you can use them early in the 90s if you have to, and you've timed Geraldo's restock properly. And speaking of Geraldo's restock, let's talk about that now, because that is something very important and incredibly useful to his setups. When Geraldo reaches level 20, he fully restocks on every item. So you can use a ton of items before then, and get a bunch of camo potions, sharpening stones, pickles, spikes, spooky totems. You can get them right before he restocks, and you'll have them back up again right after he restocks, which can be very useful for the late game, like getting 6 sharpening stones instead of 3, or getting access to 8 pickles instead of 4, or getting like 4 camo potions if you need that many. Sometimes you do. A generally good restock time for Geraldo is round 90, which you have to place Geraldo before round 21 to be able to get a restock on round 90, which is usually the best. But if you need a specific restock time for whatever reason, like I needed in my Flying Fortress runs, you can use the Cyber Quincy Discord bot to figure that out. Incredibly useful bot, super helpful for just most things Bloons related in general. And that is going to end off the part where I talk about Geraldo's items. Now I'm going to talk about some common Geraldo strategies and how to use them. Let's start off with Geraldo's strongest and most popular strategy, Geraldo Snipers. Geraldo Snipers revolves around the massive synergy between the Sharpening Stone and the Middle Path Sniper Shrapnel. Usually the way Geraldo Snipers tends to go is, in the early game, you start off by doing pretty much whatever you can to afford Geraldo at a decent time. Then you start building into a Druid of the Jungle or an Airburst sub or something like that. And then you go into a discounted Deadly Precision and Bouncing Bullet Sniper before round 40. Usually you'll only have the Deadly Precision, but sometimes you can also fit in the Bouncing Bullet as well. And then usually you'll get an Alchemist for the Bouncing Bullet Sniper, and this is where the strategy sort of splits in two. You have 2 main ways of affording an elite sniper. The first option is to upgrade your Deadly Precision to a main Moab with Shrapnel, and then try and get an elite sniper before round 63, which is doable on most maps. And then you get 2 to 3 more bouncing bullets, and then an elite defender, where you'll start to build into your late game support. Some of the best late game supports are a Monkey Intelligence Bureau, Moab/Relentless Glue, and Moab Presses. Usually you can also fit a Sabotage Ninja in there for DDT rounds. Or with the other option, you can place 2 to 3 more bouncing bullets and try and go for an elite sniper before 75, which is pretty much always doable. And then you get an elite defender and build into your late game support. Throughout the mid and late game, you should also be applying sharpening stones and pickles to your middle path snipers. This increases their DPS by a ton and is almost always worth it. If you're going for the pre-round 75 elite sniper, you're also probably going to need to use some glues for 63. It is also generally better to have your main Moab on first for the late game instead of strong, because the fast Moabs need more stunning than the slow ZOMGs do. A common round 100 solution for sniper strategies, because they don't tend to have too much bad damage, unless you're going for a cripple Moab, which I'm not going to cover here because that's completely different, is a first strike combined with Geraldo's rejuv potions. Same thing, but with spike storms. And spike storms also benefit a lot from Geraldo's buffs, which makes them a good option. And that's going to conclude it for Geraldo snipers. Now let's move on to one of Geraldo's stronger strategies, but it's also very map dependent. Geraldo tacks. Geraldo tacks revolves around bottom path tack shooters and applying sharpening stones and pickles to them because they benefit a ton from those buffs. How Geraldo tack strategies tend to go is you start out with an early game carry like Druid of the Jungle, maybe multiple, an Airburst sub, maybe even an armor piercing sub with an alch buff, and then you're usually going to build into an overdrive or 2 with an embrittlement ice monkey and a cleanup at the back like an alch buffed spiked balls. You can also alch buff these overdrives, but usually it isn't needed if you know money is going to be tight. And this setup should allow you to keep enough money to afford a tack zone, which will be your main GPS for the rest of the game. And then you can build into some more basic support, like a Sabotage Ninja, Moab Glue, Moab Press, and other such common support towers. These setups will usually do very good, with round 100, but they'll still need a bit of extra damage to be able to finish it off. Good round 100 options are the same as always: spike storms, a sticky bomb, even after the nerf, and the best one being a first strike. It is also very important to note that you always want to be placing these overdrives and bottom path tack shooters under the track, because they do a lot more damage that way. This strategy is also best used on maps like Quad, where the Bloons are split up and there isn't as much pierce to worry about, which is these tacks' main weakness. That mostly concludes Geraldo tacks. Now we can move on to my favorite Geraldo strategy, Geraldo permacharge. This strategy mostly revolves around the bug that turned into a feature, where the Gerry's fire inherits the ability buff, which makes it do insane damage. The permacharge's build-up isn't very good until the later mid-game, which is why we're going to need excessive early game carries and mid-game carries. Like, for the early game, we're going to need one, if not multiple, Druids of the Jungle, and other such common early game carries that I've already mentioned. And for the mid-game, you have many options. Like, on Sanctuary, you can use a Bads, or on most other maps, you can use 1 to 2 ISAB monkeys, which, for those of you who don't know, is a robo-monkey with the bottom cross path. These benefit massively from Geraldo's buffs, so they're really a no-brainer. They also help out a ton late game with their very useful slows. With this strategy, you'll afford permacharge at the latest round 81. The cross-pathing of the permacharge is very important. If it's in a place where it can attack everything, you're usually going to want to go with the top cross path, because it has more pierce and therefore can kill everything a lot easier. But if it's on a multi-lane map where the permacharge can't hit all of the lanes, it is very important that you go the bottom cross path, because you don't need as much pierce and the extra damage helps out a lot. And you're also going to need a secondary DPS to cover the lanes that permacharge cannot, which is another reason to go to the bottom cross path in this situation, because to afford said secondary DPS, you're going to need a lot of money, and you're not going to have enough money for a MIB, which you would need normally for the other cross path. But in most cases, going the top cross path is better. Now let's move on to late game support. Some common late game support for Geraldo permacharge is, if you're in the top cross path, a sharpening stone doesn't hurt, so feel free to use it. Don't use pickles though, it's not worth it. Some very good late game support is Relentless Glue, a MIB if you went the top cross path, which can be upgraded to a Call to Arms, which is pretty nice, and a Sabo for DDTs, which you don't always actually need, which is surprising. Because this is an ability-based strategy, you're going to want to use the ability on dense rounds like 94, 96, and 98, more specifically the ZOMGs, because you usually need to pop those down very quick. Round 100 is actually very easy with the strategy, because usually you'll be able to get it into first strike range without any extra bad damage, which is really nice. So all the bad damage you really need is a first strike. That generally covers it for the Geraldo permacharge strategy, and I know there are more Geraldo strategies like Super Monkey Spam, but I'm not going to be going over those today as this video is already way too long. And that's just going to wrap everything up. Hopefully you learned some neat things about Geraldo and how to use him properly, and have a nice rest of your day. Goodbye.